In my previous life, my sister and I married into the Harrington family on the same day. The world liked to call it destiny, twin engagements, twin diamonds. Twin smiles frozen beneath chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. But destiny had nothing to do with it. It was a transaction. Cold and deliberate, dressed up in silk and champagne. My older sister Evelyn despised the Harrington heir, Adrian Harrington. He was the firstborn, the golden successor on paper, yet he unnerved people. Too quiet, too observant. The kind of man who listened longer than he spoke, whose gaze lingered just long enough to make you wonder what he was cataloging in his mind. People whispered that he was paranoid. Others said calculating. Evelyn called him creepy and laughed it off, but I knew her well enough to recognize fear when I saw it. So she rushed instead toward the second son, Julian Harrington. Julian was famous for his composure, his restraint, his aesthetic detachment from the world. He lived half his life abroad, funded monasteries and private foundations, and treated money like something abstract, meaningless. People said he was cold, untouchable. Evelyn believed that meant controllable. She was wrong. Loneliness erodes people in quiet ways. Evelyn, who had always needed applause, admiration, noise, found herself married to a man who gave her space so vast it felt like abandonment. Julian never demanded her presence, never restricted her movements. He only cared that his rules were not crossed. When they were, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He acted. By the time the consequences arrived, they arrived all at once, swift and humiliating. What happened behind closed doors was never discussed openly, but certain doors in our social circle closed forever after that. Invitations stopped coming. Names were erased. Evelyn vanished from public view for months. People were wrong about him. He wasn't gloomy. He was romantic in a way that required patience to notice. He trusted deeply once trust was earned. I managed his assets, stabilized the family's finances, and in return he gave me loyalty so absolute it bordered on reverence. We lived well. We lived quietly. And for the first time in my life, I believed peace was permanent. That belief lasted until the night Evelyn pushed me off a building. I remember the wind more than the impact. The way the city lights fractured beneath me. The certainty, sharp, unmistakable, that my sister's hands were on my back when I fell. When I opened my eyes again, I was alive. Not just alive, returned. The engagement banquet loomed before me once more. Crystal chandeliers blazing overhead, orchestral music floating through the air, the Harrington family seated like royalty at the center of the room. My heart didn't race. It steadied. So she remembered too. I knew the moment I saw Evelyn's face twist. Moments ago, she had been telling our parents that she would only ever marry Julian. That she admired his discipline, his elegance, his distance. The next second, she shoved me forward, directly into Julian's arms. "Julian's admired you for years," she announced brightly, her voice ringing with forced cheer. "He won't marry anyone but you." Gasps rippled through the hall. "Go on, sister," she added, her grip tightening painfully at my wrist. "Don't be shy. Call him your fiancé already." Her smile was flawless. Her eyes were not. I staggered, instinctively reaching for the edge of the table beside me, and didn't touch it. Strong hands caught me instead. A faint scent of sandalwood and clean linen lingered around him. "Julian Harrington." He steadied me, then immediately released his hold, as if even accidental contact required restraint. "Miss Harper," he said calmly, voice low and unreadable. "Be careful." Anyone else might have believed the image, the distant philanthropist, the man above worldly impulses. If I hadn't lived through what he was capable of in my previous life, I might have believed it too. Lowering my gaze, I softened my expression and murmured a quiet thanks. Men like Julian valued appearances above all else. Any visible reluctance would be noted, remembered, and used. When I looked up again, I saw it. Triumph. Evelyn was reborn too. And she had chosen this moment to act. But even if she hadn't pushed me toward Julian, I would have stepped forward on my own. He was indifferent to love, uninterested in possession, and unimaginably wealthy. His wives were given freedom, real freedom, as long as they respected his unspoken boundaries. Adrian, on the other hand, if Julian was a wolf, Adrian's older brother was a snake. Charming, venomous, always smiling while calculating where to sink his teeth. The only reason Adrian had treated me well in my past life was because I held the financial leash. Evelyn had chosen poorly. My sister has always been timid, Evelyn said sweetly, turning toward our parents as if seeking affirmation, her fingers still lightly gripping my arm in a way that looked affectionate to outsiders, but felt unmistakably possessive to me. I've taken care of her since we were children. I know how shy she is, so I thought I'd help her out. She paused deliberately, then turned back to me with an expression so tender it bordered on theatrical. Harper, your dream has finally come true. You've always admired Julian, haven't you? Make sure you cherish him. He's such a refined, gentle man. She lingered on each word, saturating them with implication, convinced that she had just handed me a fate worse than death. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect sister, generous, thoughtful, selfless. To me, she looked like someone who believed she had already won. Julian, standing beside me, said nothing. His gaze swept the room once, slow and assessing, as though committing every reaction to memory, before settling briefly on Evelyn. There was no warmth in his eyes, no irritation either, only interest, the kind that made people uneasy without understanding why. Then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it could be mistaken for courtesy, and accepted the situation without protest. The Harrington elders exchanged glances. A decision, once made in this family, was rarely reversed. Across the room, Adrian watched the scene unfold with a faint smile, his posture relaxed, his demeanor easy, as though he were observing a well-rehearsed play rather than the restructuring of his own future. Evelyn mistook his calm for admiration. She didn't realize he had already begun imagining how entertaining she might be. Music resumed. Glasses were raised. Conversations restarted in hushed, excited tones. The engagement banquet rolled forward as if nothing strange had happened. But the undercurrent had shifted. People were looking at Evelyn differently now, with curiosity, with calculation, with the subtle reassessment that followed any unexpected move in elite circles. She sensed it too, and quickly recovered, slipping seamlessly into her role, laughing softly as Adrian approached her and offered his arm. She accepted without hesitation, leaning into him with practiced ease, her expression demure, her eyes lowered just enough to suggest innocence rather than hunger. Adrian's smile widened. He adored women who believed they understood him. The first dance was announced, and Evelyn took the floor with him as though it had always been meant to be that way. She was radiant beneath the lights, every movement graceful, every turn perfectly timed to draw attention. This was her element: spectacle, admiration, the certainty of being watched. The applause that followed was thunderous, and she drank it in greedily, convinced she had secured her position completely. What she didn't understand was that men like Adrian didn't cherish what was freely given, they consumed it, and once consumed, they moved on. She didn't wait. Too eager to stake her claim, too afraid that hesitation might cost her everything. She mistook immediacy for intimacy, possession for security. The next morning, she called me on video, unable to contain her triumph, draped in silk, skin marked with evidence she believed proved victory rather than carelessness. She lifted her hand toward the camera, flaunting a sapphire necklace so large it bordered on obscene, her smile smug and unrestrained as she spoke about generosity, about devotion, about vows whispered in the dark. She reminded me, unprompted, that Adrian was the eldest son, that inheritance followed tradition, that she would one day be Mrs. Harrington in truth, while I would merely exist on the periphery, collecting allowances, living off what trickled down to me. She had always loved hierarchies. She just assumed she was destined to stand at the top. I let her speak. I let her revel. Then I laughed, softly, genuinely, and reminded her that promises were cheap, that men like Adrian swore oaths the way others ordered drinks, and that history had a way of repeating itself when people refused to learn. She didn't appreciate that. Her voice sharpened. Her threats followed quickly, crude and earnest, the kind only someone utterly convinced of their own security would make. I ended the call smiling, knowing exactly how fragile her position truly was. Life, for a while, was peaceful. Julian and I were officially engaged, though his presence remained distant. He sent jewelry instead of flowers, properties instead of love letters. He was always elsewhere, in meetings, in foundations, in quiet places where the world felt far away. I lived comfortably, freely, spending extravagantly and publicly, building a reputation that grew louder with every purchase, every investment, every headline. Evelyn, meanwhile, flooded social media with carefully curated images of affection, intimacy, and bliss. She needed people to believe she was loved. I needed people to believe I was powerful. The difference showed. When her wedding arrived, it was a spectacle designed to overwhelm. Private islands, chartered yachts, guest lists packed with recognizable names. She clung to Adrian's arm all night, guarding him with the vigilance of someone who understood, at least subconsciously, how easily things could slip from her grasp. He played his role beautifully, smiling, touching her cheek, whispering words meant for an audience rather than a partner. She didn't notice the glances exchanged across the room, the familiarity between him and certain guests, the ease with which old habits resurfaced in his posture. She saw what she wanted to see. She always had. No spectacle, no celebration. Immediately afterward, he handed me the deed to a private estate registered solely in my name, explained it was a reward for obedience, reminded me of his boundaries, and left. It was, without question, the most ideal arrangement imaginable, and it wasn't enough. I didn't come back to life to live quietly. I built something of my own, aggressively, unapologetically, leveraging knowledge I shouldn't have had, making moves that seemed reckless to outsiders and inevitable to me. The markets bent, opportunities aligned. My name began circulating in rooms Julian once occupied alone. When he finally returned and invited me to dinner, it wasn't suspicion in his eyes, it was curiosity. That was the moment everything truly began to change. Power doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It settles quietly, like pressure beneath the skin, noticeable only when you realize how easily others begin to bend around you. By the time Julian started accompanying me to private dinners and closed-door gatherings, it was already too late for anyone to pretend I was merely a decorative wife. The men around those tables were not impressed by charm or lineage. They responded to precision, to foresight, to someone who spoke as if outcomes were already decided. I did exactly that. I didn't pitch ideas, I described inevitabilities. Markets shifted accordingly. Opportunities that had once been politely inaccessible opened without resistance. Julian watched all of this with an intensity he never showed the outside world, his silence no longer detached but deliberate, his presence increasingly constant, as though he were afraid that if he looked away for too long, something essential might slip beyond his reach. Evelyn noticed the shift before anyone else did. She always had a talent for sensing when attention drifted away from her, and now it was happening everywhere at once. At family gatherings, conversations no longer paused when she entered the room. Compliments grew thinner, more automatic. Meanwhile, people began seeking me out. First cautiously, then openly, asking for opinions, advice, introductions. Evelyn smiled through it all, her expressions flawless, but something brittle had crept into her movements, a tightness beneath the elegance. Adrian, for his part, had begun coming home later, his patience shorter, his temper closer to the surface. He didn't like being questioned. He liked it even less when those questions hinted at expectations. When the first whispers about mismanagement surfaced, Evelyn dismissed them as jealousy. When audits followed, she blamed subordinates. When certain partnerships quietly dissolved and suppliers began demanding immediate payment rather than extending credit, she panicked. She threw money at problems that required competence, doubled down on optics while the foundations rotted beneath her. Adrian offered little support. He never had. Responsibility bored him, and the more pressure mounted, the more he retreated into indulgence, leaving Evelyn to defend a collapsing facade alone. Their arguments grew louder, sharper, spilling into spaces that once belonged only to servants and shadows. What happened behind their doors was never discussed publicly, but bruises have a way of speaking even when mouths do not. The night everything fractured was inevitable. It happened after another family gathering. One of those carefully staged affairs meant to project unity while concealing fractures no one could ignore anymore. Adrian drank too much. Evelyn spoke too much. Old resentments surfaced, sharpened by humiliation and fear. Voices rose. Words were said that could not be taken back. When the doors finally opened and people intervened, the damage had already been done. Apologies followed quickly, frantic and insincere, accompanied by promises, gifts, and declarations of remorse that sounded convincing only to those desperate to believe them. Evelyn accepted them. She always did. She needed to believe endurance was the same as victory. It was around this time that she asked to see me. She chose the rooftop. The symmetry would have been almost poetic if it hadn't been so transparent. Wind pulled at her dress, revealing marks she tried and failed to conceal beneath fabric and makeup. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with health. She spoke calmly at first, circling familiar ground, reminiscing about childhood, about shared beginnings, about fate. Then the edge slipped. Bitterness bled through. She accused me of stealing what was never hers to begin with, of corrupting Julian, of manipulating events she could no longer control. When she stepped closer, her smile no longer reached her eyes. I saw the same madness that had preceded my death before. She talked about past lives. About inevitability. About falling. She didn't realize that I had already accounted for every possible outcome, that the door behind her had never truly been closed, that the shadows at the edge of the rooftop were not empty. When she lunged, desperate, reckless, convinced that destruction was the only remaining form of agency, she didn't fall. She was restrained, forced down. Surrounded by authority she could no longer charm or threaten. As they took her away, screaming that this wasn't how it was supposed to end, I felt no triumph. Only relief. Some cycles are meant to be broken cleanly. After that, everything accelerated. Adrian's scandals unfolded in layers, each revelation worse than the last, each denial less believable than the one before it. The public turned swiftly, viciously. Contracts were terminated. Positions revoked. By the time he was removed entirely, no one protested. He disappeared from relevance the way men like him always do. Loudly at first, then completely. Evelyn was convicted, sentenced, forgotten. The family spoke her name less and less until it became something impolite, then something unnecessary. Julian inherited what remained. He accepted it without ceremony, without visible satisfaction, and immediately stepped aside. In front of the board, in front of shareholders who once dismissed me as ornamental, he made his stance unmistakably clear. The company did not need him. It needed me. Authority transferred not through force, but consensus, the most durable kind of power there is. When I took my seat at the head of the table, no one objected. No one dared. Under my leadership, the empire didn't recover, it transformed. Every sector sharpened. Every inefficiency was cut away. The name Harper Harrington became synonymous with precision, dominance, inevitability. Julian remained beside me, no longer distant, no longer detached. His quiet devotion now unmistakable. His presence constant, protective, possessive in ways that never needed to be articulated. He had given up the world once. This time he chose to stay. As for Evelyn, prison erased what arrogance had built. When she was released years later, diminished and hollowed out, the world no longer cared enough to watch. She vanished shortly after. No one searched. No one asked questions. Some stories end not with spectacle, but with silence. And me? I stood at the pinnacle, looking down at everything I had claimed. Power earned, enemies dismantled, fate rewritten. When Julian asked me one evening what I intended to do next, his voice low, his gaze steady, I smiled and answered honestly. The world, and this time, nothing would take it from me.